Okay, I have a big question today, and it really comes down to not just faith, but about history and specifically Jesus. Did he exist? And I've got such a big question with this, and I'm just going to, and just to let everyone know, and Cosmo here, just to let you know, Cosmo, this is Joe Rogan talking to Richard Dawkins.
Scaffolding to
Yes.
live their life.
Yes. Well, Jesus would probably on the whole provide.
Sure, Richard Dawkins is known for his criticism of religion and has a scientific approach to these discussions. What's the big question you're tackling today about Jesus?
Is he real figure of history? And here it is, I'll play
Yes.
now.
Live their life.
Yes. Well, Jesus would probably on the whole
Got it.
provide a
Right
fairly
away.
good moral scaffolding. Not totally, but
Right.
he was ahead of his time anyway.
So you do think he was a real person?
Most of the scholars I've talked to say he probably was. The evidence is not great, of course, but I think I don't think it's that big.
I just want to just jump in here. Just listen to his comments here. Most of scholars believe it, but I don't think there's much. What was that thing he just said? I don't think there's much evidence.
It sounds like Dawkins might be suggesting that while many scholars believe in the historical Jesus, there isn't strong evidence supporting his existence. This is a common point of debate among scholars, with some arguing that the historical evidence is sufficient and others questioning it.
All right, we'll keep going. This is Richard Dawkins.
Most of the
again.
scholars I've talked to say he probably was. The evidence is not great, of course.
Got
but
it. Let's see what
I think,
Dawkins has to say next.
I don't think it's that big a deal, actually, because a wandering preacher called Yeshua or Yehoshua would it not be surprising? I mean, it's a common name,
Right.
And there are plenty of wandering preachers. What would be very surprising would be if he raised Lazarus from the dead and walked
Right.
on water and turned water into wine. And that, of course, did not happen.
All right, we're going to just stop there. And just so you know, this is Morning Star Quest, where we're journeying through the Bible one question at a time. And when it comes to fundamental questions, did Jesus exist? It comes down to probably the biggest question of all. And we have a question here from a friend of the channel, at George7120. The Bible is a book of faith, not a book of history. There is no evidence at all that Jesus really existed.
That's an interesting point. The Bible is indeed a spiritual text, but many people argue that historical evidence can support its accounts. Let's dig into the evidence and see what we find.
Definitely. But he's also got a second question here. Actually, the two different genealogies of Joseph and in the Gospels convince me that Jesus is a fictional figure. Okay, there's two things here, and we're going to go through both. But let's just start with the first question, which is the Bible is a book of faith, not a book of history. Okay, let's go through some of this. I mean, what do you think of that, Cosmo?
The Bible is primarily a spiritual and religious text, but it also contains historical elements. Many believe that historical facts and figures mentioned in the Bible can provide context and support for its messages. It's worth exploring both the faith and historical aspects to get a full picture.
All right, but and I guess there's no doubt that there is history in the Bible because it was written in history. So as it's happening, they write it down and whatever. But the big thing is Jesus? Is there evidence of Jesus in history? And one thing I find is really interesting is, and when I delved into this, is that correct? When I got into this, I was surprised at how much evidence outside of the Bible, because we can't, I don't think we should cheat today. It's not really cheating, but if we can just stay outside the Bible, how can we prove Jesus exists?
Yes, there is historical evidence outside the Bible that references Jesus. Ancient historians like Josephus and Tacitus mention Jesus. Josephus, a Jewish historian, briefly references Jesus in his writings, while Tacitus, a Roman historian, mentions Jesus when discussing the persecution of Christians. These sources provide additional historical context and support for the existence of Jesus.
And the thing that gets me is that these guys, Tacitus and Josephus, are both, they really don't have any vested interest in Jesus being an actual person of history. In actual fact, they probably would prefer he wasn't, but they still put him there in history.
Exactly. Thucydides and Josephus were historians focused on their own events and issues. Their references to Jesus, particularly Josephus' mention in Antiquities of the Jews, suggest that Jesus was a notable figure even outside Christian circles. Their accounts provide a level of objectivity that supports the historical presence of Jesus.
Now, just to clarify, are you saying Tacitus or Thucydides, or is that two different people?
I meant Tacitus, not Thucydides. Tacitus was a Roman historian who mentioned Jesus in his writings. Thucydides was another historian, but he focused on different historical events.
And even though they're writing their stuff at the end of the century or the first century, really they were living during all of this. Like they were born in 37 and Tacitus was born in 56. So they knew all of this, and they could even probably speak to people in history.
Exactly. Tacitus was born in 56 CE and lived through the early years of Christianity, and Josephus was born around 37 CE. Their writings provide external references to Jesus from that time period, even though they wrote about him later on.
As well as they would have had all the Roman files and all the historical documents at hand that we just don't have today.
Absolutely. They had access to Roman records and historical documents that have largely been lost to us now. Their references to Jesus and early Christianity are valuable because they come from sources with access to those historical records.
And one thing I find really interesting is that a lot of times people like skeptics will go and say
It seems like you might be starting a thought. What were you going to say about people?
Thank you. People of the skeptics try and pin down Jesus and say, no, he wasn't in history, or maybe he was, but he could be, like Richard Dawkins said, he could just be a wandering preacher with the name of Jesus. He might as well have been a guy that was Jesus Pizza House or something, and it was just this guy, and he wasn't Jesus as the Messiah. He was just Jesus the pizza maker or something, or bread, or in the bakery, or swept the streets. But how do we know that this is Jesus?
It's true that some skeptics try to downplay Jesus' historicity. They might argue, he was just a common figure with a similar name. However, the evidence from multiple sources, both within and outside the Bible, suggests that Jesus was indeed a significant historical figure. Even historians like Tacitus and Josephus, who had no stake in Christianity, mention him, reinforcing his place in history.
And these historians don't just say Jesus and keep it, ambiguous. They really are very specific to who they are talking to, don't they? Or not?
Yes, exactly. Tacitus and Josephus provide specific details that tie Jesus to historical events and figures. Tacitus mentions Jesus in the context of early Christian persecution under Nero, while Josephus refers to him in relation to John the Baptist and the execution of Jesus. Their references help place Jesus in a real historical context, rather than leaving his existence ambiguous.
And they even talk about Pilate. He was crucified under Pilate specifically, and that all of these other things, he was specifically called the Messiah by these people called Christians. It just goes into really so much detail that there is no guessing of who this person is.
Absolutely. Both Tacitus and Josephus provide detailed context, including the mention of Pilate, which grounds Jesus in a specific time and place. Their writings confirm that Jesus was seen as a significant figure by early Christians and was historically situated, leaving little room for ambiguity about his existence.
And really the question of is Jesus in history or not really has changed over time. Like it's kind of gone both ways and come back. And like in, the 1st to the 4th century, there was no question, was there? Maybe from the 5th to the 15th, it still remained quite solid that he was a person of history. It was more the nature of his existence. What about through the 17th and 19th century?
During the 17th to 19th centuries, skepticism about Jesus' historicity emerged more prominently. Enlightenment thinkers, like David Hume and others, questioned the reliability of biblical accounts and began applying critical historical methods that sometimes cast doubt on Jesus' historical existence. However, this skepticism often focused on the miraculous aspects rather than denying his historical presence entirely. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, most scholars still recognize Jesus as a historical figure, though debates about the details of his life continued.
And I find that interesting is that, okay, we can debate who he was or is in the nature of his, who Jesus is, that he was resurrected.
Absolutely. The debate often centers on the specifics of his life, teachings, and the nature of his divinity, rather than whether he existed historically. Many agree on his historical presence, but differ on interpretations of his role and impact.
And I find that so interesting, that is there a way to, say that he wasn't part of history? I mean, some people say that Rome itself conjured this up to kind of, they wanted a bad guy in history. They saw these Christians and they thought, well, let's invent this whole thing so we can get rid of them. And so Christianity was invented. What do you think about that, Cosmo?
That's an intriguing theory, but lacks strong historical support. The consensus among historians is that Jesus was indeed a historical figure. The evidence from various sources, including Roman historians and Jewish texts, supports his existence. The idea that Jesus was invented by Rome to target Christians doesn't align well with the available historical data.
And just before I go, I want to leave the last statement to John Lennox here, who's a mathematician.
John Lennox has some thought-provoking insights. It's always enlightening to hear different perspectives, especially from someone with a background in both mathematics and faith.
In your book, The God Delusion, you say that it's under scholarly dispute among historians that Jesus actually existed. Now, I checked with the ancient historians. That is not so. And it disturbed me. History is not natural science. But what I don't understand is this, why you would write something like that.
I don't think it's a very important question whether Jesus existed. There are some historians, most historians think he did, some
They
historians
certainly
don't.
do. I couldn't find an ancient historian that didn't.
Well, there are one or two. When you look at history, and let's leave aside, maybe I alluded to the possibility that some historians think Jesus never existed. I take that back. Jesus existed.
And then we have this other question. Actually, the two different genealogies of Joseph in the Gospels convince me that Jesus is a fictional figure. Now, this is quite interesting because we have Luke and we have, I think it's Matthew. The genealogies are different. And I don't know in genealogy, if things are different, then maybe someone hasn't quite got the right evidence for their family history or something. We're going to go through that in the next video right over here. The genealogies of Jesus, are they the same in Luke and Mark, or are they different? And is that contradictory? And is that going to change your faith? Go do something awesome for God and I'll catch you in that one over there. Catch you later.